What's Cain's favorite genre of music? Rock. What do you call it when Cain insults his brother? Disable. Actually, I'm not proud of that one. That one's really dumb. How long did Cain hate his brother? As long as he was able to. You can see how all these jokes are going to go. So I'm going to stop there. All right, this video is on 1 John chapter 3. So remember, when you think of John's writing, John, if you had to summarize all of John's writing into one sentence, that sentence would be Jesus is God, right? John makes it abundantly clear in each of his epistles and in his gospel, Jesus is God. Now, in the book of the Apocalypse, John also makes this point, but not quite as explicitly. But if you look at his gospel, if you look at his epistles, that's basically what he's saying. Now, he goes about saying it in different ways. For example, in the first letter of John, he goes about it by attacking the Corinthians and contrasting their belief in how Jesus and Christ were separate with the teachings of Christianity, which revolve around the incarnation. But yes, Jesus is God is the number one takeaway you need to have. So starting with chapter 3 in 1 John, we're now sort of in the second half of 1 John. And it says here, John uses the second part of chapter 3 to discuss Caritas. Yeah, he's going to do that. I'm on the wrong slide, though, so let me scroll up. Okay, so in chapter 3, John is going to discuss divine filiation and Caritas in more detail. See what love the Father has given us, that we should be called children of God. It does not yet appear we shall be, but when we know that when he appears, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is. So, what's John talking about here? He's talking about divine filiation, right? How do we know that? Because he uses the phrase children of God. Remember, Christians are adopted children of God. And he means this literally, right? By calling us his children, God is not just using like some flowery expression of love. He is literally making us his adopted children. So divine filiation refers to the basis from where we get our supernatural dignity, right? Because above all other natural creatures, we have been elevated because we have a unique bond with Jesus Christ, who became a member of our species, right? Jesus didn't become an angel. He didn't become an alien. He became a human being, right? That was in order to elevate our dignity above that of all other natural creatures. All right. And then when we know that when he appears, we shall be like him. What does that mean? When we shall be like him? He's referring to the fruit of divine filiation, which the church calls the beatific vision. The beatific vision is what heaven is, right? It is a term we use to describe heaven. More specifically, what is heaven? It is the direct, unfiltered experience of God. Right? So here on earth, we can encounter God in a variety of ways, but as St. Paul says, we do it in a way like a glass darkly. In other words, we see only a pale image of God here on earth, right? Even through the sacraments, it's not like we're getting this like direct, unfiltered experience of God. We're getting a direct experience of God, but it's through the form of the accidents of bread and wine, for example. Right? That's not the same thing as seeing God face to face. So the beatific vision, that's what happens in heaven. We are with God directly and fully. Right? And then we shall be like him. What does he mean by that? We're saying to be like God is ultimately what human beings desire most. This is the promise that the serpent makes to Adam and Eve in Genesis. He says, if you eat of the fruit of the tree, you will be like God. Right? So he's tapping into a fundamental human desire, right? The desire to be like God. So in Genesis, being like God is perverted by the serpent, by the sin of pride. He uses the sin of pride to pervert our natural desire, our supernatural desire to be like God. Um, but John's point is that the beatific vision actually transforms us so fundamentally that in a way we do become like God. Not in a prideful sense at all, though. Right? We don't become gods ourselves, but we do reach our fullest potential as creatures of God, as adopted children of God. Right? We become like God in the sense that an adopted child becomes like his father. Right? He's never going to resemble his father. He's not going to have his father's DNA, but he's going to take on other characteristics of his father. Right? So the beatific vision is going to allow us to absorb and reflect God's divinity. Okay, everyone who commits sin is guilty of lawlessness. Sin is lawlessness. Ooh, blunt. All right, okay, so every time we commit a sin, we are breaking a moral law. And in doing this, we are violating God's will. Remember previously, John said that if we love God, we keep his commandments. We do not break his laws. Right? So sin is an act against love of God. Right? Likewise, every sin is an offense against Christ on the cross, because every time we commit a sin, we are rejecting Christ and taking the side of Satan. Right? Now, this doesn't mean that every time you commit a sin, you're consciously saying, I want to make Satan my master and reject Jesus. No, that's usually not how the devil operates. The devil is a lot more subtle when it comes to how human beings commit sins. Usually, when we give in to temptations, we make excuses for ourselves, or sometimes our sins are thoughtless, they're impulsive. Right? But John is reminding us that ultimately, every time we committed sin, that's what we're doing. We are rejecting Christ and the sacrifice he made for us on the cross, and taking the side of Satan. Even a little tiny venial sin has this effect, right? Our venial sins sometimes don't seem like a big deal, but they are the result of an intense supernatural campaign orchestrated by Satan and the demons in order to obtain our souls. Right? Satan often uses small little venial sins in order to be like a gateway to bigger sins. Right? He likes to come in through the little tiny cracks that our venial sins create. Right? Okay, so remember, what's John doing here? He's talking about divine filiation against the teaching of the false teachers who believe that certain actions are not sinful, or are still okay, even if they are sinful, because their special relationship to God protects them from the effects of sin. All right, and then in the second part of chapter 3, John discusses Caritas. Remember, the test that John provides for distinguishing a true teacher from a false teacher is, do they practice Caritas? We should love one another and not be like Cain, who was the evil one and murdered his brother. Anyone who hates his brother is a murderer. So in the New Testament interpretation of the book of Genesis, Cain represents rejecting Caritas in sort of the ultimate way. Right? He fails to love God, and he fails to love his brother, his neighbor. Right? Remember, Caritas is loving God and then loving your neighbor because of your love for God. Right? Then John goes a step further and he says, the reason Cain murdered Abel is because he hated Abel. Right? And he says, true hatred is murder. So Cain hated his brother so much, the act of murder was like an inevitable consequence of it. Right? True hatred is a sin. And it comes from the same place, the same root that murder comes from. Now, murder and hatred are not identical. right? Just because you have hatred for someone and you commit that sin doesn't mean you're going to go out and murder them. But their moral consequences are equal, right? So John here is being pretty clear. He's saying hating someone, like really truly hating them, is just as bad as murdering them from a moral perspective. All right, then we get to the end of chapter 3. Sorry, I'm sitting by a busy street. It's getting kind of loud. I don't know why. All right, the end of chapter 3, John discusses faith in Jesus. So now we finally get to faith. Little children, let us not love in word or speech, but in deed and in truth. And this is his commandment, that we should believe in the name of his Son, Jesus Christ, and love one another. So basically, John is saying Caritas is not just a feeling, right? If you express Caritas, there are moral duties that come with it. You can't just love God and love your neighbor without doing anything, right? Your moral duties are related to Caritas, and they are also tied to faith in Jesus. You can't truly have faith in Jesus unless you have Caritas. You can't have Caritas unless you have faith in Jesus. This is because faith and love are inseparable. You cannot pull them apart, right? Just like Jesus and Christ are inseparable. Those Corinthians want to pull them apart. Faith and love are inseparable too. So hopefully you can see, even though John's writing is really like kind of scatterbrained at times, he does a really good job of tying everything together in his really strange way of writing. All right, that's it for John chapter 3. We'll do chapter 4 and 5 next week, and then you'll have your quiz.